Our first speaker in the series this evening is Dr. P. Whitney Lackenbauer. Dr. Lackenbauer is Canada Research Chair Tier 1 in the study of the Canadian North and a professor in the School for the Study of Canada at Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario. He is network lead of the North American and Arctic Defence and Security Network and is honorary Lieutenant Colonel of 1st Canadian Ranger Patrol Group. He has co-written and co-edited more than 60 books and more than 100 academic articles and book chapters, many of which explore Indigenous military relations and Arctic issues. His recent books include The Joint Arctic Weather Stations, Science and Sovereignty in the High Arctic, 1946-72, L'Histoire des Rangées Canadiens du Québec, I tried, The Canadian Armed Forces, Eyes, Ears, and Voice in Remote Regions, and Lines in the Snow, Thoughts on the Past and Future of Northern Canadian Policy Issues. All of those, I will add, are published just in 2022. His talk this evening, When the Skies Rain Boxes, Northern Canadians and Continental Defence During the Cold War, will explore aspects of how, quote-unquote, military modernization affected Northern Canadians and particularly Indigenous peoples during the Cold War. Topics will include the interplay between security and sovereignty priorities, various socioeconomic and political impacts of the Distant Early Warning or DEW line, and the Canadian Rangers as a uniquely Canadian form of military service in remote northern regions. With discussions on the Arctic, its sovereignty, and climate change becoming more at the forefront, these topics on the Arctic are more timely than ever. And I think we are all looking forward to tonight's discussion. I would now like to welcome Dr. Lackenbauer for his presentation. Good evening, Dr. Lackenbauer. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks, Sean, for the generous introduction and the kind invitation to deliver this talk as part of the Diefenbunker's Cold War speaker series. Over the last 2 decades, I have been really blessed to spend a lot of time up north. The most important part, I think, has been my work with the Canadian Rangers, with whom I have been privileged to travel from coast to coast to coast, whether that's squishing through boggy tundra or bombing around on snowmobiles like here on the frozen Labrador Sea. Often it's conducting interviews on the trail or in cabins or while ice fishing or while eating seal or in the midst of building snow houses or igloos, as we typically call them down south. It even involves sleeping in them from time to time, in this case with the loaded 303 Lee Enfield in the cold trap in case a curious or hungry polar bear decided to pop by for a visit. This has all meant that I have witnessed firsthand the intersections between the official sovereignty agenda coming out of Ottawa and realities on the ground for Northern Canadians. And the Canadian Rangers, I think, are an interesting way to jump into my talk for tonight. In the case of the Rangers, we have Northerners serving as reservists in the Canadian Armed Forces, certainly showing the flag for Canada and at the same time serving their communities. And on the one hand, as I do, we might celebrate their participation. Indeed, the residents of the 3 Northern Territories and northern regions like Nunavik and Nunatsiavut serve in the Canadian military in rates far beyond those of Southern Canadians. And as the key military presence throughout the North, we might celebrate this grassroots organization as a representative and proportionate way to exercise our sovereignty and security. Or we might, as some critical commentators suggest, lament the fact that the Rangers are pretty much all that we have when we get outside of Yellowknife, that our North is in peril because the Russians are aggressive, the Chinese are looking north, and climate change seems to be opening everything up to the world. Now, much of this is simple alarmism, of course, but it's telling. Certainly, the way that we conceptualize our country, the way that we orient ourselves, really influences how we set priorities. I like to highlight that Southern Canadians typically view the North as a there rather than a here, as if it's some sort of empty economic and military space that needs our Southern attention or it will slip away. Now, I've been up to Ellesmere Island on several occasions, and in this map, which flips its usual orientation of Canada, right, that's at the bottom part of the screen, right? This being the northern tip of our country has certainly forced me to think about Canada from a northern perspective because everything is south from there. But as far as I was from the political heartland, I was directly tied to the practices of the Canadian state, right? I was visiting Canadian Forces Station Alert, which is a military installation. I spent time in Grise Fiord, which was created in the 1950s when government officials moved Inuit from Quebec to the far north to try and liberate them from the food pressures they were facing in Nunavik, right? A sad story that historians have written a great deal about, and you can see represented well on the panels at the Diefenbunker when you go and peruse their Cold War section. This reminds us we need to think of the North as a homeland, and this map, which identifies various northern peoples living in the circumpolar world, reminds us that southern mindsets and geostrategic calculations are not always the most appropriate focal points. But when we find ourselves inundated with political and media narratives talking about Arctic security, talking about Arctic threats, with experts insisting we need to act decisively in the face of unprecedented challenges, I take pause as a historian. First of all, the idea that we are facing an Arctic crisis is a powerful concept. Suggests there's no time for normal political exchange, right? It demands action, particularly when you associate it with security and sovereignty. So as a historian, I'm predisposed to asking, before we jump ahead to it being unprecedented, what has happened in the past? How have these practices affected Canadians? And what reminders might they offer us for today? Do we today really face a perfect storm in the North that's without precedent? If any of you are familiar with my work, you'll know I've spent nearly 2 decades rationalizing investments in Canadian Armed Forces capabilities in the Arctic. But that said, I'm very cautious about seeing recent trends as all being truly unprecedented. I'd say that the perfect storm came in the 1950s, a product of Cold War military interests that opened up the region. And I often turn to a journalist and documentary filmmaker, Kevin McMahon, who described in the late 1980s as this perfect storm came in the form of boxes. And the pretext for this bombardment of boxes, of stuff landing in the North, was sovereignty and security. But the effects were sweeping. They were cultural, they were social, they were economic, they were political, they were environmental, and they're still with us today. But Southern Canadians tend to forget. Our interests in the North have typically been episodic. We've been apt to forget the region when sovereignty crises abate, as they always seem to do. But Northern Canadians don't have that luxury. So if my travels in the North taught me anything, it's the centrality of relationships. So what is the history of the military's relationship with the North and Northerners' relationship with the military? And tonight we're going to focus on the Cold War era. Ken Eyre once quipped that the military has influenced the North more than the North has influenced the military. I think this is a really brilliant observation. So what have these influences been? And to think about these, let's go back to the beginning. Of course, Inuit and other northern peoples had been in the North long before the first European explorers arrived. And we know that these European explorers, for all their bravado, were newcomers to the Arctic. They proved that they could plant flags, but they showed that they had a lot to learn if they actually wanted to live in the region rather than just claiming it for some kind of distant sovereign. For its part, Canada inherited the islands of the high Arctic archipelago from Britain in 1880, but then we proceeded to ignore the Arctic North for the next quarter century. There was very little thought given to Inuit and other northern peoples, apart from a few trading posts that began to extend into the region and the missionaries that eventually followed. It was the Klondike Gold Rush that prompted the first flexing of state authority to defend what, at least in the Northwest, suddenly became a resource frontier, right? This meant that the Mounties headed north, as did a small military force to show the flag. Indigenous peoples were dramatically affected, but they were treated as mere observers by the throngs of gold-struck Southerners who poured into the region. But soon after, many of us know the gold rush disappointed its boosters. The Southerners began their withdrawal only a few years after it had begun, and the Yukon slipped back into relative obscurity in the Southern imagination, kept alive only in the books of Jack London and the poems of Robert Service. Right? The government sent official missions to the Arctic to explore and collect customs duties and licensing fees from whalers in the early 20th century, the first assertions of Canadian authority in the Arctic region. This was all very modest, right? Hardly a robust, continuous government presence. The Mounties also asserted legal authority over the Inuit, but it was still predicated on overall on the idea that Inuit were best left as Inuit. The state at this point really had no interest in drawing northern peoples into the larger Canadian political project. And foreign claims still had to be settled. Our claims, particularly to the Arctic islands, were still perceived to be very tenuous, considering that British explorers had not had a monopoly on activity in the archipelago. And if you want to learn more about this, read Jeff Noakes, who's on a part of the participants tonight, his wonderful book with Janice Cavell on acts of occupation, which gives wonderful details, correcting some of the misconceptions about what was going on in the 20s and 30s, but then also explaining how Canadian negotiators reached agreements with the Danes, how we paid off the Norwegians, how we convinced American explorers to follow our rules. And this meant that Canada's terrestrial sovereignty, our ownership over the actual lands and islands, were pretty much settled by the early 1930s. And the Mounties in their scarlet tunics, or caribou skin jackets, because they were dressed appropriately, they learned their stuff, right? They were the human flagpoles asserting Canadian sovereignty in the North. And very little thought in this era was given to the place of Northern peoples in supporting Canadian sovereignty. And of course, there was little cause for worry, no real need for a military presence. Between the wars, Canada, in that famous phrase, was considered a fireproof house, right? A distant northern country insulated from European and Asian crises by geography. But during the global inferno that was the Second World War, North America no longer seemed isolated, right? Canadians still considered the Arctic to be a natural defensive barrier, but the Americans were really concerned about Alaska and the overland and air routes to their northernmost territory. Geographically, of course, Canada was in between. So the US and Canada entered into agreements to build airfields, the Alaska Highway, an oil pipeline in the northwestern corner of the continent. Canadian government did not have the resources to build these installations, even on its own territory. As a result, the American Corps of Engineers swept into Canada to manage the task, so that by the end of 1942, there were certainly more than 10,000 American personnel on Canadian soil. In many areas, their numbers surely dwarfed those of the Canadian residents who lived there permanently. This had human and environmental impacts. Right? The Western subarctic might have looked unoccupied on Southerners' maps, but of course, the Northwest has been the homeland to Indigenous people since time immemorial. Most of the Athabascan societies practiced a mixed economy, blending traditional subsistence lifestyles with fur trade opportunities. And despite their relative isolation, these cultures had already adapted to the presence of small numbers of traders, that influx of miners we talked about, whalers, policemen, the occasional bureaucrat. But this sudden flood of newcomers contracted to undertake wartime construction projects was truly unprecedented, at least since the Klondike Gold Rush. And their arrival was also unexpected. Casca elder Amos Dick of Ross River, Yukon, once told me how, as a young boy of about 13, he was hunting in the bush near his community when he heard a tremendous noise. Soon he witnessed strange men crashing through his people's lands on their Caterpillar tractors. They were building the Kamloops Road completely unannounced to the local peoples. And we're fortunate in that historians Ken Coates and Bill Morrison have done an admirable job of pointing out the various effects that these activities had on the residents of the Canadian Northwest, showing how the impacts of militarism extended beyond the exigencies, the immediate needs of war itself, but affecting societies, affecting populations. And the war's influence wasn't just in the Northwest. Project Crimson was conceived to allow the ferrying of short-range fighter aircraft over to England. So meteorologists built weather stations in the Eastern Arctic, as well as airfields to serve as stepping stones for aircraft. And these military facilities really initiated a process of, as what Sean said, like I've called with my colleague Matt Farish, a process of military modernization that really culminated in the 1950s. For example, Frobisher Bay, which many of us now know as Iqaluit, was a temporary fishing spot for Inuit of southern Baffin Island, but had never been the site of a permanent settlement or a trading post. Its first permanent incarnation was actually Crystal 2, which was an air base and weather station at the head of Frobisher Bay and became a stop on this Crimson staging route. And it was effectively a small town growing up almost overnight with every imaginable amenity to Southerners. And this exposure to Western life really had a transformative impact on local inhabitants. Tomasi Nglingnik encountered the Americans in 1941 when they first arrived in Frobisher Bay to find a location to build houses and an airfield. I mean, this quote is amazing. I love what he's capturing here in terms of culinary delights, right? New tastes, new foods, that being mystified watching a movie and what was being depicted there and how strange that would have been, right? To Inuit who had followed a seasonal cycle living on the land, didn't have electricity and certainly didn't have anything resembling movie theaters. He recalled how the Haudenosaunee, the non-Inuit, started giving us biscuits and sugar and tea, chocolate and Coca-Cola. Then there were cigarettes, and then there was modest wage employment. And as this quote suggests on the slide, movies were this completely new phenomenon for Inuit, provoking fear but also fascination. And the arrival of the Americans really marked a turning point in the history of the region. Before the war, the only Haudenosaunee that Niglingnik's family had seen were the Hudson Bay Company employees. They had never seen mechanized vehicles like bulldozers. He recounted when they started unloading their ship, their vehicles just started moving on the ground, even though they were made of metal. Looking back, we must have thought they were from the moon. Right, I'll resist the temptation to go on, but suffice to say that the air war drew the Arctic and subarctic into the military map like nothing before, and it also catapulted the North onto the national political agenda. Prime Minister Mackenzie King was paranoid that American developments in the remote Northlands, taken in the name of military security, would undermine Canadian sovereignty. And he listened to Vincent Massey's warning that the Americans might just waltz in and treat us like we were, quote, a docile band of Aborigines. Obviously offensive language today, but very telling at the time. So the government sent up a military commissioner to oversee the defense projects. When the war was over, paid off the Americans to ensure that the ownership of the various installations built in the Northwest were unquestionably Canadian. So what was ironic was that the United States had set the development agenda on the basis of security concerns, and then Canada had supported it, even if mostly symbolically, for sovereignty reasons. And in this case, there were no long-term legal ramifications of the Americans building this infrastructure, but there were social and political effects as the Northwest receded from the political spotlight at the end of the war. After the war, of course, the geostrategic focus turned from the Northwest to the Canadian Arctic more generally, right? As that idea of a Cold War set in, decision makers in Washington and Ottawa hauled out their polar projection maps, which they usually pulled from National Geographic. And Canada was, of course, sandwiched between the superpowers. The US immediately raised the possibility of a Soviet attack over the pole. So the link between the defense of Northern Canada and the security of the North American heartland was clear. So it's key. They were talking about threats through the Arctic. It wasn't that the North was a place to be defended because it had some kind of intrinsic value. It was seen as a strategic approach. It was seen as an exposed front. So with this logic, the US military began to return to the Arctic to build airfields and weather stations. LORAN stations popped up in various locations like Kitakazooit, where Inuvialuit men like Joe Teddy were hired to drive tractors to maintain the ice airstrip. Getting everything, even 2 weeks, they gave us rations, he recalled. He and his wife Mary lived in tent frames, built using wood from the garbage dump. And other Indigenous people hired by the Royal Canadian Air Force fixed up 3-log cabins that had been built by reindeer herders back in the 30s and lived in them until the station shut down. The Air Force would airdrop fresh foods like beef, bananas, apples, oranges. Again, Coca-Cola comes up in all these stories. Even drop them uniforms. For the men working at the site, the Indigenous men, there was no time for hunting or trapping given their work schedule, but they would get Sundays off for fresh air and talked about canoe rides. Also loved those nightly movies after their ships in. So some Indigenous peoples are slowly being drawn in to military projects. This also brought them into focus for government protection. And a story that I've written about that I find really interesting, at least, relates to African-American units from the United States, which the US proposed to use to build northern installations in the early Cold War period. But this ran into some wrinkles because the Canadian government accused African-American soldiers serving in segregated battalions during the war of introducing venereal disease, of sexually transmitted infections, to the Mackenzie district during the war, which they ironically called white man's diseases, but that's telling, right? So Canadian officials disallowed the Americans from actually sending segregated battalions into the Canadian North, or when they were allowed, very seriously monitored them and segregated them off from local populations. Martha Michael, who was a young girl living in Frobisher Bay in 1948, recalled, "We were told that Black people were unruly and that we females should be scared of them. In fact, they went and the Canadian authorities moved all of the Inuit women from the community to an island called Ukaletulik while African-American soldiers worked on the airstrip that summer. At that time, we went through a rough time, she noted. We Inuit didn't have control over our lives anymore. So this is a telling statement. This was less a preoccupation for Canadian officials than the fear of embarrassment, right? For them not being sufficiently careful in protecting the welfare of Northerners, or they were concerned about being put in a politically and diplomatically intractable position by rejecting African-American units. It's just interesting because to me, it shows how racial categories factored into decision-making. Right up to this point in time, it was always women who were blamed for venereal disease. And certainly during the Second World War, most of what the Canadian state talked about was Indigenous women as being causes of problems for these labor battalions during the war. Now, after the war, all of a sudden, you're using race as a variable to blame men, in this case, African-American men, for infecting and potentially tainting, right, Indigenous peoples who are considered to be pure and free from these kind of ailments. So very interesting, but you can see how this became a pretext for the paternalistic state to kind of also reach in and take actions that were obviously curtailing the freedoms of Indigenous peoples. Now, taking things back up to the general level, what about Canada? Were we content to be safe under the protection of Uncle Sam? Right? Did we have the resources to guard the North by ourselves to the satisfaction of the Americans? I'd say it's obvious we didn't, but we couldn't allow the Americans to undertake a long polar watch by themselves from Canadian territory, because this would admit that we were weak and maybe our sovereignty was weak. So I'm still captivated by this concept of defense against help to understand our Cold War Arctic strategy. And decision makers in Ottawa recognize that the United States, in the process of guaranteeing Canada's safety as part of the overall defense of the North American continent, the US could itself become a sovereignty threat. So if Canada wasn't willing or able to defend the northern approaches to the United States, the idea was the Americans would be compelled to take whatever measures it required to ensure its own security, regardless of what Canadians preferred or what we wanted. So Canada really faced this dilemma. How could we protect the continent against the Soviet Union, right? Something we couldn't do alone, while at the same time protecting our northern sovereignty from the United States. Well, to deal with this issue, the Canadian government did not want to pay to station large numbers of combat forces in the north, so they looked to inexpensive solutions. So having paratroops based in southern Canada and trained in the north made sense, right? They could be deployed northward in the unlikely scenario of a Russian attack. But what would happen while they were in transit and once they got up there? How would they know where to go or how to operate? Well, the military also recognized that having eyes and ears in northern and remote regions made sense. So in 1947, it established a unique, rather peculiar, but I mean that in an endearing way, volunteer force called the Canadian Rangers. And the logic was because northern residents know their local areas very well, they would be able, with very limited training, to hold off a potential enemy invader and act as guides and scouts when regular military forces arrived in their homeland. So armed with bolt-action rifles, 200 rounds of ammunition a year, armbands, so they were lawful combatants, right? They had a uniform, and then very little training or direction, Ranger units extended into camps in the far north, where Inuit and other Northerners looked to the skies and seas to report any strange activities. They trained the military when the military infrequently came north. As for rifles and ammunition, the Rangers were encouraged to use these for hunting. The idea was it would keep up their marksmanship, and it was a little perk to feed their families. So it seemed to be a reciprocal benefit. And certainly a rifle was not a tool to be taken lightly in the late 1940s and 1950s. Rangers and other northern peoples trained southern troops who ventured north on their winter warfare training, right, teaching them how to build shelters, like here in Cambridge Bay or Iqaluit, where elders still recall the great city of igloos that soldiers would build on the bay alongside the community. And while threat estimates remained very modest, this tempo and scale seemed appropriate, right? It seemed proportionate to the threat environment in the Arctic. But by the early 1950s, once the Soviets developed atomic and then thermonuclear weapons, right? The consequences of an attack from the air grew exponentially. And the US deterrence strategy was based on the premise that its retaliatory force could blast the Soviets into oblivion, right? What today we call denial by punishment. And to get your bombers into the air to retaliate, you needed to have some advance warning. So Canada was under the US strategic umbrella. We concurred with this logic. And accordingly, the lion's share of the Canadian defense budget now went to the Air Force. And the new hum was that of radar lines built to detect a Soviet invasion. So it's a turn away from the kind of human surveillance associated with the Canadian Rangers and Northerners themselves. The idea was the Arctic was a vast buffer, right? Why not use it to strategic advantage? So the distant early warning line, the DEW line, was built across the 70th parallel between 1955 and 1957 to detect Soviet bombers, right? Its creation was really an extraordinary feat of geographical engineering. The whole process of constructing and then resupplying it dramatically altered the military, logistic, demographic Canadian characteristics of the Canadian Arctic. It was really a Big Bang moment. To learn about one of the mid-lines, the Mid-Canada line along roughly the 55th parallel, I'm going to promote a book that I did with Jeff Noakes, who's also listening in on this call, called Special Contract by Alex Lester, which is excellent. And to learn about what it was like living on the line, I think Brian Jeffrey is also on the call here. Recommend his wonderful memoir, Adventures in the Coldest Part of the Cold War, to get a sense of what life was like for people actually working at the stations. I'm going to kind of both elevate the discussion and also sort of take it off to a sub-theme, and maybe we can come back to some of their experiences and insights a little bit later on. So the US paid for all of the DEW line construction, which prompted journalists and the political opposition in Ottawa to suggest that this again was a case where Canada was going to lose its sovereignty. But once again, as had been the case in the Second World War and in the case of some of the early weather stations in the post-war period, Canadian negotiators worked out a favorable agreement that protected Canadian sovereignty. But there were side effects, even if our sovereignty was secure. Canadian decision makers naively believed that they could insulate Northern Indigenous peoples from the impacts of mega projects. And at the time, right, you can see the dismissive and highly offensive language characterizing Inuit as if they lived in a state of primitive development and needed to be protected by the government from outside forces. This was all about the arrogance of military modernism, that the state could control environments and peoples and interactions between peoples. Reality, of course, proved differently. Changes were subtle. Most of them were unopposed by Inuit. So the idea of the totalizing state going in and forcibly relocating Indigenous peoples to serve some kind of liberal agenda associated with the DEW line, like scholars Frank Tester and Peter Kolczynski depict in their books, is nothing that I'm seeing in the evidence itself or that I've heard from the oral histories. It was more benign inducements and relationships that people, that led people to become sucked into the vortex of military modernization. The DEW line served as a site for cross-cultural interaction in the Arctic, which had a major impact on Northern peoples. Until the 1950s, the vast majority of Inuit still lived as hunters in their family groups following a seasonal cycle, and then supplemented this lifestyle with a limited trapping income. But for the most part, they were self-sufficient. They existed outside of mainstream capitalist society. Now they encountered Western culture in different ways than they had before with the Hudson Bay Company and the missionaries and the sprinkling of government officials who occasionally ventured into the region. Right? Newspapers talked about how Inuit had been catapulted from the Stone Age to the Atomic Age almost overnight. I mean, it's fascinating for me to work through with students the different newspaper stories and depictions of Inuit, but also assumptions about what was seen to be the inevitability with the onset of modernization, of them being drawn into the world of the rest of Canada. While at the same time, there was this contradictory desire that wanted to keep them Inuit and would have preferred to have them following their traditional way of life, and a cynic might even say keeping them off of government welfare rolls. In terms of employment, in the late 1950s, DEW line construction and a few operational jobs provided many Inuit with wage labor for the first time. The actual number of Inuit men employed on the line at any given time was actually quite small. There was never more than 100 people. But when one considers the population of the North which was very, very small to begin with, and the effects that wage labor had on an extended family's activities, the magnitude of the impacts was far broader than focusing on these numbers might suggest. And as Inuit began to congregate around the dew line sites, the first urbanization along Canada's coast took place. So for people who didn't have easy access to wood and metal, for example, the dew line garbage dumps were attractive business, right? The dew line stations with all these wonderful foodstuffs, frozen foods flown in, right, had too much to consume and would dump perfectly good food into these garbage dumps. People wisely, though somewhat counterintuitively, it seems very offensive to my sensibilities today, right, but kind of smartly went and availed themselves of it, right? They certainly availed themselves of building supplies that could not be acquired in the Arctic tundra. And we had settlements like Tuktoyaktuk and Cambridge Bay, Iqaluit and Hull Beach, Centeraic, and Broughton Island, Kikik-Tarjuak, growing up around these dew line sites. In turn, the migration of workers and families to dew line job sites influenced Indigenous lifestyles and cultural dynamics, right? Jobs were often temporary, but they changed lives profoundly. If an Inuk hunter didn't hunt or trap for a season or two, their equipment was no longer usable. And furthermore, a dew line job paid roughly 7 times that of the average trapper's income. And an Inuk who worked on the dew line also got permanent housing, and in many cases in their stories suggest they weren't anxious to return to the previous migratory lifestyle. And women who had access to material goods often tell stories about heading to the dump to find their next meal for their children, while their husbands were invited to eat in at the dew line mess halls. So they found their traditional roles disrupted. So the dew line placed the Arctic in the Canadian political consciousness, and at the same time, it transformed Northern life irrevocably. There was no going back. But Northern Indigenous peoples who were most directly affected by the mega project were never consulted on it. And like most projects conceived to deal with security crises, the dew line's geopolitical relevance soon passed once the Soviets spit Sputnik up into space and the space race was on. And although Inuit and other Northerners continued to work for the dew line, it's fair to say that ultimately they influenced the military far less than the military influenced them. Now, Northerners continued to play a more direct role in defense, as it was through the Rangers, at least in theory. By 1960, a fellow by the name of Captain Ambrose Shea, who was a Ranger liaison officer looking after the Eastern Arctic, complained that the basic message he'd received from Ottawa was that the Rangers may exist, but under no circumstances can we have them actually do anything. I mean, I've had many conversations with Rangers over the years. It confirms at that time they didn't really understand their role. They certainly didn't understand the Southern concept of soldiering. You get a sense of that from the quote here on the slide. But they were very useful friends on the ground who were interested in serving the military and took their roles as seriously as they understood it. This wasn't what officials had intended for the Rangers, but however imperfectly the Rangers, or the military for that matter, understood their role, Shea really still saw a place for them. The quote, the idea of arming a local population and asking them to take a hand in defending their own locality is an ancient one and eminently sensible, he argued. It doesn't become outdated, even in this atomic age. So the Rangers' contributions were modest, but they underlined a relationship between the military and Northerners. And if the Rangers' rifle was like an engagement ring, as Shea said it was, the military's romance with the North and with the Rangers seemed to be really on the wane. Indeed, over by the late 1960s, right? Just as the dew line became operational in 1957, new strategic delivery systems like intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, pushed NORAD, pushed the North American Air Defense Command, now it's aerospace, right, to shift its emphasis away from static radar lines. They began to look to, say, satellites, which are much more versatile. And this shifted focus away from meeting Arctic lands. And as a result, the Canadian Arctic itself was no longer considered a key theater. The North American air defense system was allowed to atrophy beginning in the 1960s. The Navy, for its part, stopped doing Arctic cruises, got rid of its Navy icebreaker, HMCS Labrador, that it had for a short time during the construction phase of the dew line. Army stopped exercising in the north. Canadian Rangers, well, they weren't shut down formally, but they were left to wither on the vine. For its part, the government's focus shifted, at least for a short time, to the north as a resource frontier. It's interesting, Diefenbunker's great northern vision really didn't have much space for northern peoples. His preoccupation was the benefits that northern resources would accrue to southern Canadians. And really, his vision was a national economic plan. But like most northern policies, his vision was bolder than his resolve to actually implement his ideas. And southern Canadians didn't really care enough to push this federal agenda. In terms of proceeding into the 1970s, Canadians took renewed interest in the Arctic thanks to their American friends. 1969, the American supertanker, the Manhattan, transited the Northwest Passage to see if it was feasible to carry oil from Alaska to the eastern seaboard through waters that Canada considers to be internal, meaning they're subject to our full control, our full sovereignty. The US disagrees, says, no, there's an international strait, right? These waters connect two bodies of high seas, two oceans, so therefore we have the right to sail through uninterrupted. These are still the positions Canada and the US hold to this very day. Well, journalists were concerned that this American tanker smashing through the Arctic waters had implications for Canada because we had stewardship responsibilities in the region, right? What if it ran aground along the Northwest Passage? Scientists said it would be absolutely catastrophic. The Canadian public was very concerned. Politicians got the message. Now they began to talk about a delicate Arctic, needing Canadian action to go and extend jurisdiction northward and make sure that we were safeguarding it. So interesting, right? We're again framing foreign, particularly American activities as a threat to Canada. And now, for the first time, there began to be some talk about the need to protect Northerners' human rights to live in a wholesome natural environment, to take steps to make sure we were preserving it for Northern peoples. Well, a new defense policy statement in 1971 affirmed that sovereignty would be the primary role of the Canadian forces. There was a lot of Arctic rhetoric for a short time. Northern Region Headquarters was created in Yellowknife. The Navy went back up on northern deployments, NORPLOYs. RCAF, the Air Force, went up on northern patrols over the Northwest Passage. Land Force exercises resumed. Virtually every element of the Canadian Forces was involved in northern area in the early 1970s. And even the Canadian Rangers, who'd been left to atrophy, were revitalized. It was kind of half-heartedly, but they were revitalized. What the military really wanted to do was recruit Inuit and other Northerners into the regular forces. But their Northern Native Entry program was a dismal failure. And I'd suggest, I'm glad it failed. Major Ken Eyre astutely observed late in the decade that it didn't make much sense to try and recruit away the most educated and disciplined residents in Northern communities, right? These were the very individuals who were needed to assume leadership in the changing North, who would arguably benefit Canada and their communities best by staying in their home communities rather than being assimilated into the military and being deployed abroad. And ironically, defense planners at the time did not recognize that the Rangers, however peculiar and modest they were as a military organization, had all of the right ingredients for success. And they really fit with the changing North, right? The landmark Berger Report emphasized the North was not just a frontier, but a homeland. Indigenous peoples demanded that their land claims be settled before major development took place. So we now see sovereignty taking on internal dimensions. And government officials, for a short time at least, seem to internalize the message from foreign affairs that at its core, Arctic sovereignty didn't require some kind of military set piece, as you see in the quote, right? It was about governance, ongoing continuous governments, not flag planting, not symbolism. And this, coupled with détente and changing Cold War priorities, killed any plans for major investments in Arctic defenses by the time we get to the mid-70s and beyond. And when the Americans abandoned their oil transportation plans, the US threat to Canadian sovereignty subsided. Ottawa again lost interest in the Arctic, so the Canadian military presence diminished once again almost as soon as it began. All right, the sovereignty issue came to the fore again in 1985. Again, an American vessel, US Coast Guard icebreaker Polar Sea, pushes through the Northwest Passage for practical reasons, dealing with resupply. Canadian government kind of wanted to let the matter float past, but academics and opposition politicians and Inuit spokespersons suggested this challenged Canada's internal waters position. So suddenly a relatively benign matter with the Americans, right, our neighbor and arguably best friend and key ally, is transformed into another political crisis. External Affairs Minister Joe Clark issued a landmark statement on sovereignty in September of 1985 that encapsulated the growing concern and linked it to Northern peoples. And it's a striking quote. It really marked the changing times. The indivisibility of Arctic land and sea and ice, right? The Inuit people and their historic use of the islands in the Arctic Ocean since time immemorial. And also the government's commitment to preserving Canadian sovereignty when facing threats, real or perceived, right, like US icebreakers. So in the wake of the Polar Sea, the Conservative government took various measures to consolidate Canada's legal position over our Arctic waters, officially drawing straight baselines around the archipelago of islands, right, like an arrowhead pointing north towards the North Pole, saying any waters within these lines are internal to Canada, subject to our full sovereignty akin to land areas. The military also revived military operations in the north, upgraded its northern airfields for fighter aircraft, right, like we're going to have to do very soon for the F-35s, presuming that they actually arrive, right? They promised to set up fixed sonar surveillance under the water at key choke points in the Northwest Passage, also promised to build a Polar 8 class icebreaker to assert Canadian sovereignty, right? This is a big icebreaking vessel. And then finally, some of us will remember, right, in 1987, the government announcing that it was going to acquire a dozen nuclear submarines to operate under the sea ice and presumably challenge anyone entering our north. So Conservative governments energized to make military things happen once again. Sovereignty crisis is translated into the need for defense capabilities, right? No time for dialogue with Northerners, given that we're facing an existential threat from a US icebreaker. Well, it does get tied into the resurgent Cold War under the Soviets, right? Well, what about Northerners? Beginning in the 1970s, we have scholars like Nils Orvik who began to broaden definitions of sovereignty and security to accommodate Northern people's interests and values. So if the old model of security was very narrow, right, very state-centric, almost entirely focused on military aspects of problems and military solutions, new frameworks expanded the idea to include themes like environmental security or talk about human security of Northern peoples. So in an era of land claims, of growing Indigenous self-awareness, policymakers could no longer ignore the impacts that defense strategies have on Northern peoples and Northern environments. So defense strategies now had to weigh the impacts on Indigenous peoples and on the environment. And this really came in the late 1980s to play in low-level flying controversies, growing concerns about the environmental footprint of military installations in the North, and quite public appeals by Indigenous leaders to demilitarize the North, all of which expanded this debate about security. So, for example, writing in 1986, George Erasmus, who was the National Chief of the Assembly First Nations, proclaimed that there was no military threat in the North, and that the real threat was to the cultural survival of Indigenous peoples posed by a military buildup. And the president of Inuit Circumpolar Conference, Mary Simon, who's of course now our Governor General, drew similar parallels between military activities, which, quote, she said, was justified by the government on the basis of defense and military considerations, but often served to promote our, meaning Indigenous peoples, insecurity. So again, we've got a broadened definition of security that's now raising questions about the inherent benefits of investments in military capabilities. And I think it's kind of interesting. Remember I mentioned before about Canada and defense against help? Well, now we have Indigenous people suggesting that Northern residents might need protection from Canadian military activities, right? Ostensibly things designed to protect Canada actually caused insecurity for Northerners. This played out, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into detail, but some of us will remember the controversy over low-level flying around Goose Bay back in the late 1980s, when Canada wanted to expand NATO low-level flying training operations in Labrador and Eastern Quebec, thinking that it was a low population density, but this brought a lot of concern from the Innu, so First Nations peoples in Southern Labrador, who at that time were facing some pretty deep social challenges and political challenges in their communities, trying to nurture their communities back to health by returning to the land, but now face these low-level jets flying and spooking caribou and throwing off their ability to live on the land. So a lot of focus on human security needs and really putting this into sharp dialogue with what the benefits are of supporting our NATO allies, particularly in Europe, who are unable to conduct a lot of low-level flying operations there because the population is too large and the risk factors are different. So again, really difficult trade-off that pits the military against Indigenous peoples. And there were occupations of runways and bombing ranges by the Innu that continued in the late 80s into the early 90s. In 1990, of course, pivotal year, right? The collapse of the Eastern Bloc. Some of us remember the friction over the Meech Lake Constitutional Accord, right? Armed confrontation between soldiers and Mohawks at Ganawage and Kanesatake, Oka, Quebec, meant that the Goose Bay issue was sort of displaced from national headlines. And in fact, the collapse of the Berlin Wall sounded the death knell for all these expansion plans at Goose Bay, which were canceled eventually in 1990, because all of a sudden it looked like the Cold War was going to be over. Now, what's interesting is the Rangers are a stark contrast to this low-level flying debate through all the controversy, right? Here you got a picture of an Inuk Ranger from Postville butchering a caribou in his Ranger sweatshirt during a training exercise, right? Serving as a member proudly of the Canadian Forces. And although pro-military advocates critiqued traditional Indigenous land-based activities when it came to the Innu, who were opposing NATO expansion, these very same people held up Inuit First Nations and Métis Rangers as essential, right? They celebrated their traditional skills because this made them excellent guides and survival instructors for other members of the CAF and for foreign air personnel at Goose Bay. So Indigenous people's knowledge and intimate contact with the land, the very things that the Innu were claiming was essential to maintain their way of life, were valuable to the Canadian military and those of their allies to maintain their capabilities to operate in the North in the form of the Rangers. So all very ironic. Also ironic that the Rangers continued to grow even after most of the other Northern defense projects proposed by the Mulroney government were scrapped. And in the 1990s, Canadian Armed Forces underwent another period of chronic decline. It was only the Rangers who survived the cut and, in fact, dramatically grew in the North, particularly Indigenous communities, partly because they were very inexpensive, also because it was great to have a force comprised largely of Indigenous peoples showing the flag for Canada as partners, right? Patriotic Canadians in the military, but in a very distinct form of service. So a very positive relationship that has stood the test of time. And remarkably, I argue that it's precisely because funding was so limited and command and control was so unclear that the Rangers matured into a truly grassroots organization in which they serve their home communities as much as they serve the military. And there is no tension between military security, human security, and environmental security where the Rangers come in. And this meant that by the dawn of the new millennium, nearly every community in the Arctic that could sustain a Ranger patrol had one. And this very much fit a government agenda in the 1990s when Canada went through a big pitch. I'm not going to go into detail on any of this, but just to bring us up to what some of our conversations may be in Q&A, right? A period of Arctic exceptionalism where military security concerns were replaced by those of diplomacy and human security. This changed in the early 2000s where people began to talk about climate change and the opening up of the Arctic, and that perhaps the Cold War and the removal of its chill over the region brought new patterns of activities that might undermine or somehow jeopardize Canadian sovereignty. People propose this thinning ice scenario, that as the ice melts, so will our claim to the Arctic. Is it because of a Russian threat to Canada's Arctic, an American threat? Who is challenging us, right? It depended on the situation. Some of us got our knickers in a knot for a certain point about Hans Island, which of course we came to a wonderful agreement last year with the Danes to go and solve peacefully. Certainly during the Harper era, the common refrain was that sovereignty was a matter of either using it or losing it. And we had a whole spate of announcements of military projects ostensibly promoted so that Canada could assert its control over the Arctic. And lots of images like this one from Operation Nanook in August 2009, right, with very strong, muscular, sort of stand up for Canada type political messaging. But then there were Northern critics who said the focus was misplaced, that use it or lose it is a misnomer, that you don't need the military to have boots on the ground. We have lots of mucklucks and chemics on the tundra in the form of Northerners who've been using the Arctic for millennia. And their message was, hey, Ottawa, use us, fund us. Historically, they're the people who've been disproportionately affected by sovereignty and security practices designed in Ottawa or Washington and then imprinted on their homeland. So even if this has generally been unintentional, they're understandably reticent about another round of what they see as a militarization of the Arctic agenda. And we have people like Mary Simon suggesting if you're looking for areas of focus, perhaps it's not defense, right? Deal with the well-known social, health, economic, human, environmental crises that really exist in the Arctic. I always say this sets up a zero-sum game, right? A one or the other scenario, when really what we're looking for is some kind of a balance. And really, we look at Canada's Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, striving to articulate what that balance looks like. We can talk more about this in question and answer. But to wrap things up, as I see it today, part of what history reminds us is to think about the nature of the threats that we're facing and how we're seeing the Arctic play into addressing threats. Are we talking about threats like next generation delivery systems being developed by competitors like Russia and China that would pass through the Canadian Arctic to strike at targets outside of the Canadian Arctic? So this gets melted into this idea of Arctic defense or Arctic security, but I suggest what we're looking to the Arctic to do is be a place where we have strategic defense in depth once again, like the DEW Line era, where it's about having forward bases, forward operating locations, sensor systems, radar systems that are able to detect and help to defeat particular threats that would be passing through the region because it's the shortest distance to strike at targets outside of the region. Then we face threats to the Arctic. And in this case, I really don't think it's any more likely that we're going to see a massive Russian or Chinese invasion of the Canadian Arctic in 2023 or 2029 than we did back in the late 1940s or 1950s. So it begs us, what are we thinking as being the threats to the Arctic? What does this look like in an era where we're reconsidering what constitutes military threats, where people talk about hybrid threats or below the threshold activities, below the threshold of armed conflict? What does this mean in terms of influence activities? How much responsibility does the military have to be able to help the North respond in case of pandemics, like we experienced with COVID, and are once again maybe facing the scenario of having to grapple with once again? And here you'll see I've snuck in a picture of a balloon reminding us of very recent developments as well that call for having military responsiveness. And then we have a whole suite of threats within the Arctic, ones in which our military is also called upon to respond. Environmental emergency, we've just seen what's happened in Yellowknife, right? Good friends of mine losing homes in places like Enterprise this summer as their community literally burnt down before them. Right, the important roles that the military plays in Operation Lentis to go and help to bolster our response. So to wrap things up here, it's reminding that sovereignty begins at home, as the Inuit have always insisted, and that we need to always retain a sense of the Arctic as a place. It's not just an exposed military front. And paying heed to such advice is the only way, in my mind, to avoid the up and down cycles that have historically characterized our approach to the Arctic, right? We need sustained engagement. So going forward, how can the government of Canada expand our military footprint in the North while minimizing the detrimental effects on Northerners? For Northern peoples, the most recent spasm of interest in Arctic security is but one in a long line of such crises that have dramatically shaped their homelands. Their concerns about the future are framed by their past experiences, as are all of ours. And as they constantly remind me in their words and their actions, right? The Arctic is not just a space, but a place populated by Canadians with very long memories.